Welcome to Autism Knows No Borders, a podcast where people connected to autism inspire change and build community. Together with the Global Autism Project, I'm your host, Rachel Harmon, a professional with over a decade of experience in the field of autism services, outreach, and advocacy. What makes a peer support group effective? And what should autistic individuals consider when looking for one? Autistic Self-Advocate Stephane Guidon shares what has worked for his peer groups at the National Autistic Society, the largest autism charity in the UK, dedicated to creating a society that works for autistic people. Originally from France, Stephane works for the National Autistic Society as a senior branch engagement officer and project lead. This episode is part one of our conversation, originally released on February 24, 2023, and we discuss Stephane's journey of self-discovery, how he relates to his autistic son, autism awareness in France, Stephane's role at the National Autistic Society, and key components of a successful peer group. In this episode, discover what's possible when you connect peer-to-peer. And now, I present you Stephane Guidon. Hi, Stephane. Welcome to Autism Knows No Borders. Thank you for being here.
Hi.
Let's start with a brief introduction.
Okay. I work for an organization called the National Autistic Society, which is the largest autism charity in the UK. And I'm a project leader. And currently, I work on a project which aims to train, guide autistic adults to form their own social peer groups all over Wales, because it's a pilot which is happening in Wales. So that's my thing.
Okay, great. We'll definitely get into more details of your project later on. But I'd like to first talk about your autism. So when did you learn about your diagnosis?
So it was back in France where I'm from, and I was 16, and I went all through schools. I went to what we call in France pedagogues, which is like child psychologists, basically. And I was just dipping in and out, never really understanding why I was being sent there. But, it kind of like took me out of school, so I didn't complain, but never really understood what was the idea behind it. At school, I guess my handwriting wasn't too great. I was always one of those like can do, but won't do kind of student. There was a few things I was really, really good at. And everything else I just had no interest, maybe because I wasn't stimulated or, just showing very little interest in insight. Now that I work with a lot of, autistic people throughout the board, I know how that presents. But at the time, I just didn't have any idea. It's only when I went to see another child psychologist when I was 16 that I filled out a test. I didn't actually realize that it was, an autism matrix test. I just filled it out. And he took me in and he said, okay, so, based on the test, it's very likely that you've got what we call, Asperger's syndrome. And I said, well, so, okay, is that bad? Is my, is it physical? Is something's going to happen to me? I said, no, nothing like that. Look, I'll tell you what it means is, so there's two kind of people. You've got people who are sprinters and people who are long distance runners. And you're a long distance runner. And to this day, I don't think that made any sense. And it really hasn't helped me at all. And I had to discover everything for myself, what that meant, what it meant to me, how to apply it, avoid the pitfalls. And actually, my story is very similar to a lot of autistic people that I know around my age. Difficulties holding jobs, trying to get the best fit, failing miserably, and I went from like job to job. It's only now, very recently, now like 45, that I found my niche. But that's because I decided to really kind of accept what was going on and actually just jump right into the autism business. And I realized that by doing that, I failed, or finally I've got a job where I belong, because I'm lucky that I'm treated very well where I am. Obviously, I would be because, it's an autism organization.
Right.
But it's, I really fit it. But also know a lot of people who are still struggling even now to kind of make peace with it and use it to the best of the advantage. I'm still struggling with, bits and pieces in terms of, theory of mind and communication and getting the wrong end of the stick and how I need to present myself. Social burnout is a big one. But overall, I'm not doing too bad. But sometimes I do think that back when I was 16, if things had been explained to me a little better and I knew what my shortcomings were going to be or the areas that I needed to work on and develop, so my life would be a bit more straightforward, it definitely would have helped, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, almost 30 years ago in France, what was the understanding of autism?
Well, it still hasn't moved much from 30 years ago, but it's definitely, it really doesn't have definitely 30 years ago, it didn't have a positive slang to it. It was seen as a disability, but it was seen as a disability as the same bag as schizophrenia or psychosis or even Down syndrome or anything. It was really seen as something that was life limiting, opportunity limiting, and there was so little understanding of it. Even now, I struggle to find people in France who really have a good handle on what it is. I remember talking to, because my son is autistic as well for my sins, and I remember when my son was born, I spoke to my dad about ranking, and this is it. And it was really hard for him to get his head around it. And he was a really smart, well educated man, but this was just so out of his backyard. Just did not have, never met anybody that was autistic. And I think that's it. In France, you really have to chase after them because it's somehow they're hiding. They're all in hiding. It's really hard to actually find autistic people who will, come out and almost disclose, I'm autistic and this is my life and those are the things that I need. So definitely in France, I think it's still not a taboo subject, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I think there's a lot of work to do to turn it into something that's, positive or at least, different, but we can work with that.
Right. Well, culturally, there's just a big stigma around mental health in general in France, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, mental health. I'm lucky that here in England there is a big discussion around it, but in France, I don't want to seem anti-patriotic, but France can be quite a chauvinist country and quite set in their ways when it comes to certain things. And I think mental health is one of those. There is again poor understanding, not much treatment going around. You really have to be at a certain level of need or in crisis for something positive to happen. But community level, you're not going to find or never ever seen community center or practitioners who really work like at neighborhood level. That just doesn't seem to exist unless you're in crisis and you go to hospital. But there doesn't seem to be anything else under that, which shows the lack of knowledge and the damage that it can do. Not just to the economy, but to families, to communities, and so on. It's a shame, really.
Yeah. I think there's, some progress that's been made, at least in the past few years, even with research.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is a lot of research being done. And, depending where you're going in France, you can see it's like everywhere, there's like example of good practice. And what you want to see ideally is, those network of like good practitioners and good research kind of like joining together for the greater good and not just, but this is my research and this is my research and, not going to share because of politics of geographical locations. But you're right, there is progress like everywhere, but it's just slow.
Yeah. Okay. So, Stephane, what are some of your autistic strengths or special interests?
Ooh, my strengths. I've got a pretty good memory for facts that I'm interested in, but that sounds so autistic. But I really do have quite a good memory for certain things, like almost like encyclopedic level, quite good at researching things that I'm interested in. I think actually I managed to get quite empathetic and, to others, but that took a lot of practice. I'm still struggling sometimes to put myself in somebody else's shoes, but that's why I'm lucky that because I've been working from a young age, I've kind of gathered those skills, painfully, so I could like function in the society.
Mm-hmm.
And my shortcomings, I guess, they're the same as everybody else. That we're all in the same boat. Social burnout is quite a big one for me. I need an awful lot of me time every day, hours and hours of me time. Once I've done a day's work, especially if it involves speaking to people, I'm really wiped out by the end of the day, even if it's working for just a few hours. I know a lot of people who are similar. I've got somebody I work with who, she would do the social thing for like a day, and then she would unplug everything, and you just can't get hold of her for 3 days straight. And that's, at first I saw that's a bit taking it too far. And actually, knowing her situation, I realized actually not that's generally what she needs to do in order for us to recharge the batteries. Yeah. Because that's one thing that I've learned is that autistic people are kind of like social levels of energy are very small. If you think of it as like a battery, your average person might start on like 80% first thing in the morning. My battery is like 20%. That's on a good day. So I really need to look after myself and cut out, all the distraction. I think one of the downside of that is, I've got very few friends. I'm not especially good at like maintaining friendship because to me it looks like a lot of work. And again, that sounds like typical autistic comment. But I'm lucky that the two friends that I've got, they're also autistic, so they know exactly what it's like. So I don't have to like try too hard, and I don't have to feed it and nurture it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Is your wife autistic?
No, she's not, but she's English, so it's fairly similar. No, but she's she really understands, but she's one of those. She's really independent. We don't with the case that we've got with my son, who is quite because he's autistic, but he's also diabetic type 1. So his life and her life by default is quite regimented. So when we get time off, we don't really want to like hang out together and do stuff as a couple. It's like I do my things and, she goes out and see her friends or go and do yoga. So, we kind of like, we make it work, and we've always made it work. We didn't have to have massive conversation. Sometimes, we do feel, we haven't spent time together for ages. I don't feel it as much as she does, but that, I do realize, actually, she needs to spend time with me now, and I do need to spend time with her as well. Mm-hmm. It's about being able to identify it, but like I said, because our life is so regimented, sometimes I lose myself into the day-to-day, into my interest and looking after my son and so on. And before you know it, it's like 3 months have gone by.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's wow.
Yeah. Hey, Rachel here. Do you know anyone else who might benefit from listening to this episode? Maybe an autistic person wanting to grow their community, a parent wanting to support their loved one, or a professional wanting to develop their skills. I encourage you to share this episode if you'd like to help them out. And now, back to the conversation. You said you have 2 kids?
Yeah.
Okay, and one is autistic?
Yeah.
Do you feel a special connection to the one that's autistic?
Yeah, and it's not just like the biological aspect of it all. I really do, actually, especially when he was younger. It was awfully easy to get down to his levels. He was anything he was into, like video games or Sonic the Hedgehog or whatever, I could generally get on his wavelength, and we spend hours just bashing it with like games and so on. But as he's growing up now, I've been able to identify those milestones, and sometimes it's quite uncanny how much of his milestones are similar to mine. But he's got the knowledge and the understanding and the diagnosis, whereby up until my teenage years I didn't. But I can see his milestone in like his vocabulary would be like the same, few thousand words, and then something would happen, no obvious reason, and suddenly would just make a massive leap, and his reasoning and his vocabulary would just seem to like jump massively. It's like, how did he get that from? And actually, it's so internal, and it's just stuff that he picks up. It's at school, and he internalizes it, and sometimes it comes out. And when it comes out, it's like, right, okay, it's changing, and so you get all those milestones, and actually you can really see them in. I've worked with children and young people on the spectrum as well, and you can see that when you work long enough with an autistic child or an autistic teenager, you can see those milestones and how they hit them and what they want to do with them. And yeah, it's really, really interesting how they grow and how they evolve. Really fascinating.
Cool. How old is he now?
Is about, in February will be 16. Oh my God, 16.
Oh, wow.
And so far we haven't had the typical stuff. My daughter is a bit older. She's 2 years older. And we haven't had any of the typical teenage stuff, the much more grounded that I was. I was an absolute disaster when I was a teenager. Just awful. So badly behaved is untrue, but compared to that, my two kids, they just don't know what we've done, but we must have done it right. They're just lovely, no trouble, straight A students. Are you actually imagining? at the minute DNA test. So it's just amazing once you've got the knowledge and you know the pitfalls, you can avoid it. But it's also been really hard with the kids. For a long time, we couldn't find appropriate placement for my son because he was never going to do mainstream. So it's always been like SEN, specialist school. And we've just struggled because I live in a place which is quite, not rural, but, it's not exactly London. And there's only so many specialist schools around. And we've tried them all, and each of them just really let us down. And now he's somewhere where he's really happy. And again, we were talking about those milestones. He just keeps hitting new milestones, like almost like every month. So it's amazing. But yeah, it's been really a hard fight. And I know a lot of parents of autistic children, they would tell you that as well. They would say it's been such a fight. And it's such a shame that it has to be that way, that you need to go through all those hoops in order to find, that one place you will really understand your kid and treat him right.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Stephane, let's transition into talking about your work.
Okay.
So tell us about your organization, the National Autistic Society.
Yeah. So the project I'm working on is actually part of a bigger vision that the National Autistic Society has. And one big part of it is the idea that, we almost we didn't coin autism as a superpower, but sometimes when we talk about the strategy, that's the kind of take we want on it. I always find autism as a superpower a little bit corny. However, I do think it needs to be presented in a much more positive way. So it's really about, positivity, and it's about what autistic people have to offer society. I think that's the big thing. So I guess my role in that big strategy is that by enabling autistic adults to form peer support group, it's the beginning of that process. It's the beginning of getting autistic people out in the world, and for them to be seen doing stuff that normal people do. One of the big assumptions because this was a Welsh government project, so government gives us money for the project. We had the money for about, the project runs until 2025. And the brief was, show autistic adults how to form peer support groups. But on the back of that was the idea that it was under the umbrella of loneliness, which is obviously, loneliness in the UK is a public health matter. It's a killer. And we know that autistic adults specifically are 8 times more likely to experience feeling of loneliness and isolation. So when that happened, and there's nothing to kind of alleviate this feeling of loneliness, the only place they're going to go is mental health services, because chances of developing anxiety, like crippling anxiety, that increases tenfold. Feeling of depression up to like clinical depression, that increases massively as well. So the big idea, I think, behind the project really is to make sure that we have autistic adults in the community who don't fall into, the pits of depression and loneliness. So that was the kind of brief from the project. And that project has taught me so much about not making assumption. We were thinking, if you bring autistic adults together, will they come? Can they travel? Do they have any money to attend activities? We had all those questions, and actually all those, at the beginning, we kind of view them as potential barriers. We know that there's like only 20% of the autistic population, not even that, who is actually holding down a job. So if they don't work and don't benefit, how are they going to go bowling every week? So that's not realistic. And then one of the massive challenges is that in Wales, and that's the reason I think the pilot took place there, it's quite big. It's like, it's fairly big compared to the UK, but there's more sheep than people. It's, it's really spread out. There's only like 3 cities, and the rest of it is like little town, little villages, and little winding roads, and just mountains everywhere. Statistically, we know that those people are there. So how do we get them together? One big challenge as well was we were coming out of COVID when I started the project properly. So traveling was a big no-no at the time. But when I started hanging out with people informally, before I started setting up groups and showing adults how to do those groups, I could see that they were so anxious to do this. But at the same time, they were desperate. They were desperate for social contact, but they were really anxious to go out and put themselves into that situation, because you put yourself in a very vulnerable place when you meet unknown people, and suddenly there's 20 people in a restaurant, you don't know any of them. And they're all in the same boat because they're autistic. So that's the big idea. But it's very challenging. And obviously COVID did not help.
Right.
When you tell autistic people, you need to stay home and not touch anyone, don't go near anyone, they really take it to the letter. I know I did. Even so, after 6 months of that, even me, I got a bit sick of it and social distancing. So it was a big part of the project, was kind of like jogging people out of that, right, and like getting them out in the world.
Yeah. Okay. So having had some experience now in leading some of these groups, or getting people to lead the groups themselves, what would you say are some key components for a successful peer group?
That's a very good question. When I look back at, for example, two groups which work exceptionally well, the pilot group and another group that I'm working very closely with, one of the things that was the main ingredients was the group leader is really good. And what I mean really good is that, first of all, he's autistic. He's on Asperger's syndrome. That's how he identifies himself, and that's fine. His son, who is like nearly 30 years old, is also autistic. When I approached him, it was like, there was nothing like that that's been done in my area. I'm just desperate to get that started. But the way he thought about it, that's what made it work. He was thinking about it and what he called the hub and spoke model. where the group is the hub. And eventually, when a group grows more confident, you can get like different spokes coming out of the group. So you can take one person who is gone so confident in a group that he wants to start his own group and he wants to lead his own group. And maybe they will have a completely different interest, and that's okay. But the main hub was a bowling group. Basically, that's what the group became. The secret of it, one of the main secrets, was that Simon, who was the leader, communicated with the group all the time through email, all the time. You know, he would say, okay, next group is in 4 weeks' time, 1st of Feb. And then he would spend every week sending a reminder so people didn't forget and so they could prep. Just a tiny little email, just really small thing. Hi, everyone. Just a reminder that it's happening on that day. And that's it. And he would send one every week until the event. Event would happen. Everybody would turn up at the bowling place. They would have a really good time. They knew that Simon was there. They knew that the group was there. Sometimes there would be new people coming in, and that was okay too. And then at the end of the session, everybody goes away. Simon would send an email for the next one, and so on. So communication and thinking about preferred method of communication, because some people like to text better, not an email. Some people like the phone call. So it took all of that into account. So each person was treated as an individual, as part of the group. The other thing that made a massive difference is that the venue was the same every time. And that for that group, some groups it's not necessary, but for that group, it was absolutely necessary. And that's why it got so successful, is because it was the same venue. And we got really lucky with that venue because basically it's in a caravan park, and the hub of the caravan park, the kind of like social community space, it's always open. So in there, you've got a bowling alley, you've got a pool room, you've got a cafe, and you've got an actual bar as well. And there's tons of space. And it's never really, really busy because of where it is. It's quite secluded. So the owner also happens to be autistic. So there were so many things that aligned with that group. But once we secured the venue, that's when the group really took off. The one thing that was really interesting, and that's where I've learned really the benefit of the group, is we had a couple of people, when they came and play bowling, you could really tell because, bowling is not a natural activity for an autistic person. When you think of like all the stimulation, loud noises, banging lights, screen like flash at you all the time, you don't think, we might have issues there. And we've had a couple of people who came in the first time. One of them was becoming, who actually came forward to become a leader soon. He was almost like vibrating with stress on the first one. And you couldn't talk to him. He was just so tense. But, he was playing. And eventually I put him aside and I was like, you're right. And, I can see you're a bit tense. And this is a bit too much for you. And he said, yeah, it is too much. But I'm just so desperate to attend something that I want to be here. I have to be here. I have to challenge myself because if not, I just won't go anywhere. And now he's become a core member of that group. And he trashes everybody at bowling when he never played before. And even so he's really quiet, he would be the first one to sit at a table with somebody else, with a new member, for example. And it's just absolutely brilliant. And that's a real success story.
Yeah.
And we've got another group who is very different. They don't have a set venue. They've got venues all over the shop, very varied. But again, the crowd is lovely, the group is lovely, the leader is very sensitive to the people's need, and that's what really works. So it's just brilliant to be part of that, really.
Right. Yeah, you're giving people a sense of belonging to a community that otherwise wasn't there. And that's so important, especially one for this population who is already feeling isolated amongst the rest of society. But yeah, also during a pandemic, coming out of a pandemic, when people are afraid. So setting up a safe space where they feel welcomed and understood and validated, especially if the leader themselves is autistic. I mean, that's the point of the peer-led support group, right?
That's right.
Thanks for tuning in to Autism Knows No Borders. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and come back next Thursday for part 2 of my conversation with Stephane, where we talk about the importance of having autistic people leading peer groups. Thanks for listening. Take care.